single photograph can hold a lifetime of secrets. In the spring of 1899, the Caldwell family walked through the doors of Harrington's photography studio on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, their Sunday finest pressed and starched, their expressions carefully composed. Thomas Caldwell, a respected bank clerk with graying temples and a stern jaw, guided his wife Margaret by the elbow. Behind them followed their 3 children, Eleanor, 15, with her mother's delicate features, Robert, 13, already showing his father's broad shoulders, and William, the youngest at 9 years old, clutching his right hand inside an elegant kid leather glove. The studio smelled of chemical solutions and varnish. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the afternoon light, replaced by the soft glow of carefully positioned lamps. James Harrington, the photographer, had operated this establishment for 12 years, capturing the faces of Philadelphia's middle class in silver and glass. He greeted the Caldwells with practiced warmth, ushering them toward the painted backdrop depicting a tasteful garden scene. Margaret Caldwell adjusted her navy silk dress, smoothing invisible wrinkles with trembling fingers. She had spent 3 weeks planning this moment. The appointment had been scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Thursday, when the spring light filtered through the studio's skylight at just the right angle. She had chosen the children's outfits with meticulous care, Eleanor in cream lace with a high collar, Robert in a dark wool suit that made him look older than his years, and William in a crisp white shirt with a burgundy vest. The glove had been Margaret's idea. She had purchased it from Wanamaker's department store on Market Street, spending more than she could afford on the supple leather. It fit William's right hand perfectly, elegant and refined, the kind of accessory a gentleman's son might wear for a formal portrait. The left hand remained bare, as was customary for boys his age in studio photographs. Harrington positioned the family with professional efficiency. Thomas stood behind Margaret's chair, one hand resting on her shoulder. Eleanor sat to her mother's right, her posture impeccable. Robert stood between his parents, and young William was placed at his mother's left side, his gloved hand resting casually on the arm of her chair. The photographer noticed everything. It was his job to see what others missed, to adjust a collar here, straighten a tie there, to capture not just faces but the essence of families. He noticed how Margaret's gaze kept drifting to William, how her jaw tightened when the boy shifted his weight. He noticed how Thomas stared straight ahead, his expression carved from granite. He noticed how Eleanor and Robert carefully avoided looking at their younger brother. Most of all, he noticed the glove. In 12 years of photographing Philadelphia families, Harrington had seen countless variations of formal attire. Boys wore their Sunday best, their hair slicked with pomade, their shoes polished to a mirror shine, but a single leather glove worn indoors on only one hand? That was unusual. That was deliberate. That was a choice made to conceal rather than decorate. William stood very still, his 9-year-old body rigid with the effort of maintaining his pose. His brown eyes, so much like his mother's, remained fixed on a point beyond the camera. The gloved hand rested exactly where his mother had positioned it, fingers slightly curved, thumb visible. The other hand hung at his side, small and pale in the lamplight. Harrington ducked beneath the black cloth draped over his camera, adjusting the focus with practiced turns of the brass lens. Through the ground glass, the Caldwell family appeared upside down, a reversed image of Victorian respectability. 5 faces frozen in formal composure, 5 people bound together by blood and secrets, and one leather glove, burgundy against the dark wood of the chair, hiding whatever truth lay beneath. The photographer emerged from under the cloth and held up the flash powder. In a moment, he would ignite it, and the magnesium would burn with brilliant white light, capturing this family forever on a glass plate negative. Whatever they were hiding, whatever had prompted Margaret Caldwell to purchase that expensive glove, would be preserved in silver halide crystals for generations to see. 6 months before the photograph was taken, Philadelphia's textile district hummed with the sound of progress. The mills along the Schuylkill River ran day and night, their smokestacks painting grey streaks across the autumn sky. Thomas Caldwell had worked at Riverside Cotton Mill for 18 years, rising from floor supervisor to manager of the weaving department. It was steady work, respectable work, the kind of employment that allowed a man to rent a decent row house in Kensington and send his children to proper schools. Margaret had married Thomas in 1873, when she was just 17 years old. Her father, a schoolteacher, had approved of the match. Thomas was ambitious, serious, and Protestant. He didn't drink to excess or gamble his wages. He attended services at St. Michael's Lutheran Church every Sunday and believed in discipline, hard work, and maintaining appearances. Margaret had learned to appreciate these qualities, even if they sometimes made their home feel more like an institution than a family. The children had arrived in regular intervals: Eleanor in 1884, Robert in 1886, and William in 1890. Each birth had been difficult for Margaret, but she had persevered, raising her children according to strict principles of behavior and propriety. Eleanor showed promise in her studies, particularly in literature and music. Robert was strong and athletic, already talking about following his father into mill management. And William, the unexpected late addition to their family, was the gentlest of the three, with an artist's eye for color and form. It was William's artistic nature that had brought him to the mill that October afternoon. The boy had begged his father for weeks to see the weaving machines, to watch the patterns emerge from the mechanical looms. Thomas had finally relented, bringing his youngest son to work on a Saturday, when the child had no school obligations. Margaret had dressed William in his older brother's hand-me-downs and kissed his forehead before they left, making Thomas promise to watch him carefully. The accident happened in the span of a heartbeat. William had been standing beside his father, mesmerized by the way the shuttles flew across the warp threads, creating intricate patterns at impossible speeds. Thomas had turned away for just a moment to speak with a floor worker about production quotas. In that moment, William had reached out his right hand, wanting to feel the threads, to understand how something so beautiful could emerge from such mechanical precision. The machine caught his hand instantly. 2 fingers disappeared into the mechanism before Thomas could pull him free, before the boy's scream could fully form in his throat. The loom operator hit the emergency stop, but the damage was already done. William's right hand, pulled from the machine, was mangled beyond recognition. The middle and ring fingers were crushed, the bones shattered, the tendons severed. Thomas had carried his son through the streets of Philadelphia, running the 6 blocks to Pennsylvania Hospital, while William wailed in agony, his small body convulsing with shock. Margaret had arrived at the hospital an hour later, her face white as chalk, her hands shaking so violently she could barely sign the consent forms for surgery. The doctor, a weary man named Stevens, who had seen countless mill accidents, worked for 3 hours trying to save what remained of William's hand. In the end, he had no choice but to amputate the 2 damaged fingers at the knuckle. The boy would live, the doctor assured them. The hand would heal, but it would never look the same. William would never hold a pen the way other boys did. He would never play piano or grip a baseball bat with confidence. He would carry the evidence of his father's momentary inattention for the rest of his life. Thomas said nothing during the doctor's explanation. He stood like a statue in the hospital corridor, his shirt still stained with his son's blood, his jaw clenched so tightly Margaret could hear his teeth grinding. When they finally brought William out, his right hand wrapped in layer upon layer of white bandages, Thomas turned and walked out of the hospital without a word. He returned 3 hours later, smelling of whiskey and rain. Margaret didn't ask where he had been. She was sitting beside William's bed, holding his left hand, singing the lullabies she had sung when he was an infant. The boy slept fitfully, his face flushed with fever, his bandaged hand resting on his chest. The weeks following the accident transformed the Caldwell household into a place of whispered conversations and careful silence. William recovered slowly. The bandages changed every other day by a visiting nurse who arrived promptly at 9 in the morning. Margaret stayed home from her volunteer work at the church auxiliary. Thomas returned to the mill, but came home each evening with shoulders more hunched than the day before. Eleanor and Robert were told the truth in stark, minimal terms. Their brother had been injured. He would be different now. They were to treat him kindly, but not to coddle him. They were never, under any circumstances, to discuss the accident outside the family. Margaret had been particularly emphatic about this last instruction. The children understood what she meant. Shame lived in silence, and respectability required secrecy. When the bandages finally came off in December, William's hand looked like a stranger's appendage, grafted onto his small wrist. The doctor had done his best, but the scars were vivid and permanent. The stumps where his middle and ring fingers had been were covered with puckered pink tissue, still tender to the touch. His remaining fingers, the thumb, index, and pinky, seemed disproportionate now, like notes missing from a musical chord. William stared at his hand for a long time that first day, turning it slowly in the winter light that filtered through the parlor window. He didn't cry. 9 years old, and he had already learned that tears changed nothing. Instead, he asked his mother if he could have his drawing pencils back. Margaret had brought them, along with a stack of paper, and watched as her son taught himself to hold the pencil in a new way, gripping it between his thumb and index finger, pressing it against his palm for stability. But while William adapted with the resilience of childhood, Margaret could not let go of the horror. She saw the stares when they walked to church. She heard the whispers at the grocer's when William reached up to point at something on a high shelf. Philadelphia society in 1899 operated on rigid principles of appearance and propriety. Physical imperfection was something to be hidden, managed, or, if possible, corrected. A child with a maimed hand raised questions about the family. Was the father negligent? Was the child reckless? Did they have the means to provide proper care? Thomas had offered to send William to a special school in Pittsburgh that accommodated children with disabilities. Margaret had refused. "He is not disabled," she had insisted, her voice sharp with desperation. "He is our son, and he will live a normal life." Thomas had not argued. He rarely spoke about the accident at all, carrying his guilt like a stone in his chest. Margaret began planning the photograph in February. The idea came to her during a sleepless night, lying in bed beside her silent husband, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind rattle the window panes. A family portrait, she thought, something formal and beautiful, something that would prove to the world and perhaps to themselves that the Caldwells were still respectable, still whole, still worthy of their place in Philadelphia's middle class. She spent weeks researching photographers, finally settling on James Harrington after seeing his advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer. His studio specialized in tasteful portraiture for discerning families, and his prices, while steep, were within reach if she was careful with the household budget. She made the appointment for late April, giving herself time to plan every detail. The glove was the final piece of her carefully constructed facade. She had tried other solutions first, positioning William's hand in his pocket, hiding it behind his brother's shoulder, draping it with a handkerchief. Nothing looked natural. Nothing looked right. But the glove, the expensive, elegant, utterly impractical kid leather glove, that looked intentional. That looked like a choice made for fashion rather than necessity. She had practiced with William at home, showing him how to rest his gloved hand on the arm of a chair, how to hold his fingers just so, how to keep his expression neutral and calm. The boy had complied without complaint, understanding in the way children do that. This mattered deeply to his mother, even if he couldn't quite grasp why. On the morning of the photograph, Margaret had dressed William herself, buttoning his vest with trembling fingers, smoothing his hair with pomade, sliding the burgundy glove onto his scarred hand. "You look very handsome," she had told him, and he had smiled his gentle smile, the one that still broke her heart every time she saw it. James Harrington had been photographing families long enough to recognize the weight of untold stories. Every portrait session was a performance, a carefully staged presentation of how people wanted to be remembered. Some families radiated genuine warmth, their affection evident in every glance and gesture. Others, like the Caldwells, carried tension in their spines, in the set of their shoulders, in the spaces between them that should have held ease, but instead held only careful distance. He adjusted the camera one final time, checking the focus through the ground glass. The image was perfect from a technical standpoint, the lighting balanced, the composition traditional but elegant, the 5 faces arranged in pleasing proportion. But something nagged at him, something about the glove and the way Margaret Caldwell's entire body seemed to angle protectively toward her youngest son. Harrington had seen his share of families trying to hide imperfections. A mother would position herself to conceal her expanding waistline, before announcing another pregnancy. A father would turn his head to hide a scar from a workplace accident. A child would be dressed in layers to disguise her thinness from tuberculosis. In Victorian Philadelphia, appearance was everything, and the camera could be both truth-teller and co-conspirator. He emerged from beneath the black cloth and prepared the flash powder in its metal tray. "Please remain very still," he instructed, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "When I count to 3, there will be a bright flash. Don't be startled, and most importantly, don't move until I tell you the exposure is complete." The Caldwell family froze in their poses. Thomas's hand tightened on Margaret's shoulder. Eleanor straightened her already perfect posture. Robert held his breath. William kept his gloved hand exactly where his mother had positioned it, his small body rigid with concentration. "1," Harrington called out, lifting the flash tray. "2." He struck the match against the strip on the box, the sulfur smell sharp in the enclosed space. 3. The magnesium powder ignited with a brilliant white flash that filled the studio like a miniature sun. For a fraction of a second, the Caldwell family was illuminated in stark, unforgiving detail. Every line on Thomas's face, every thread in Margaret's dress, every carefully arranged hair on the children's heads, and William's gloved hand, pressed against the dark wood of his mother's chair, looking simultaneously out of place and perfectly intentional. The flash faded, leaving purple after-images dancing in everyone's vision. Smoke drifted toward the ceiling, carrying the acrid smell of burned metal and chemicals. Harrington waited the requisite 15 seconds before announcing, "That's wonderful. You may relax now." The family exhaled collectively, their formal poses dissolving into more natural positions. William flexed his shoulders, rolling his neck to relieve the tension of holding still. Margaret immediately reached for his gloved hand, adjusting the position of his fingers, even though no one but Harrington would see the gesture. "Will it be ready soon?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully controlled. "The photograph, I mean." "I'll develop the plate this evening," Harrington assured her. "You can return next week to review the proof and place your order for prints. I recommend at least one large portrait for display, perhaps several smaller versions for family members." Thomas nodded curtly and began counting out bills from his wallet, his movements mechanical. Margaret stood smoothing her skirts, keeping one hand on William's shoulder, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Eleanor and Robert had already moved toward the door, eager to escape the studio's chemical smell and oppressive formality. As the family prepared to leave, Harrington caught William's eye. The boy looked back at him with an expression far older than his 9 years, a look that suggested he understood exactly what this photograph represented. A beautiful lie, a carefully constructed fiction, a moment frozen in time that showed everything except the truth. "Thank you for your patience, young man," Harrington said quietly, and William responded with a small sad smile that made the photographer's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The Caldwells filed out into the April afternoon, leaving behind only the lingering scent of Margaret's lavender perfume and the ghost of their images captured on a glass plate. Harrington locked the door behind them and returned to his darkroom, where the real work of photography began. The chemical transformation of light into memory, of moment into permanence. Serve carefully staged performances into the historical record that future generations would accept as truth. James Harrington spent the next week developing the Caldwell portrait with meticulous care. The darkroom was his sanctuary, a place where the world outside ceased to exist, and only the alchemy of light, chemistry, and time mattered. He worked in near silence, guided by the ritual of his craft, pouring developer onto the glass plate, watching the image emerge in sepia tones, fixing the image with hypo, washing away the excess chemicals, and finally drying the plate for inspection. When the portrait was ready, Harrington mounted it in a simple wooden frame and placed it on his workbench. He studied it for a long time, not just as a photographer, but as a man who had spent his life interpreting the unspoken stories behind every family portrait. The Caldwells were posed with textbook formality, their expressions carefully neutral, their clothes immaculate. Margaret Caldwell's gaze was fixed on the camera, but her body angled slightly toward William, as if she were shielding him even in stillness. Thomas stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his face a mask of stoic control. Eleanor and Robert flanked their parents, their postures rigid with the effort of maintaining decorum, and William, the youngest, sat at his mother's left, his gloved hand resting on the arm of her chair. The glove was a perfect match to the rest of his outfit, its burgundy leather catching the light in a way that drew the eye. To the casual observer, it looked like a fashionable choice, a subtle detail that spoke of refinement. But Harrington knew better. He had seen the way Margaret had adjusted that glove before the flash, the way her hand had lingered on her son's, the way William's eyes had held a quiet resignation that no 9-year-old should possess. The photographer printed several copies of the portrait, as was his custom, and placed them in a folder for the Caldwells to review. He included one large print for display and several smaller versions for family members. As he prepared the order, he wondered how long the lie would last. How long could a family hide a truth as visible as a missing finger behind a piece of leather? How long could they maintain the fiction that everything was as it should be? When the Caldwells returned to the studio a week later, Margaret was the first to speak. "Is it ready?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Harrington nodded and brought out the folder. He laid the large print on the table and watched as the family gathered around it. Margaret's eyes scanned the image, searching for flaws, for anything that might betray their secret. She saw only what she wanted to see, her family, whole and respectable, captured in a moment of perfect composure. Thomas examined the portrait with the same critical eye he used for his ledgers, searching for signs of imperfection. Eleanor and Robert leaned in, their expressions a mixture of pride and relief. William stood slightly apart, his gloved hand hidden behind his back. "It's perfect," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Exactly what I wanted." Harrington said nothing. He had learned long ago that some truths were not meant to be spoken aloud. He handed her the folder with the prints and accepted payment with a quiet nod. As the Caldwells left his studio, he watched them walk down Chestnut Street, their figures growing smaller in the spring sunlight. He knew he would never see them again, but the image they had left behind would remain in his archive, a testament to the lengths people would go to preserve their dignity, their reputation, their place in the world. For years the portrait hung in the Caldwell parlor, a centerpiece of their carefully curated domestic life. Visitors admired its beauty, praised the family's elegance, and commented on William's stylish glove. No one ever asked why a boy wore a single glove indoors. No one ever questioned the careful positioning of his hand. The lie was complete, the secret preserved, the truth hidden in plain sight. The portrait became a fixture in the Caldwell household, a symbol of their resilience and respectability. It hung above the fireplace in the parlor, flanked by family heirlooms and framed photographs of ancestors. Every Sunday after church, the family would gather in the parlor to receive visitors, and Margaret would point to the portrait with pride, explaining how it had been taken at Harrington's studio, the finest photographer in Philadelphia. William, now 10 years old, had learned to live with his altered hand. He adapted his drawing and writing techniques, teaching himself to grip a pencil between his thumb and index finger, using his palm for stability. He practiced until his handwriting was nearly as neat as his siblings. He learned to tie his shoes with his left hand, to button his shirts with careful patience, to hide the awkwardness of his right hand in public. But the portrait was a constant reminder of what had been lost. Every time he passed the parlor, he saw himself as he had been on that April day, his gloved hand resting on his mother's chair, his face composed in an expression of forced calm. He saw the lie, the careful construction of normalcy, the silent plea for acceptance. Margaret watched her son closely, always alert for signs of distress. She saw the way he avoided shaking hands with strangers, the way he tucked his right hand into his pocket when walking in public, the way he flinched when someone looked too long at his hand. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the isolation that came from carrying a secret too heavy for a child to bear. She tried to compensate. She encouraged him to draw, to paint, to spend time outdoors. She arranged for piano lessons, hoping music might give him a sense of accomplishment. But William remained withdrawn, his gentle nature replaced by a quiet reserve that worried his mother. Thomas, meanwhile, buried himself in his work. He returned to the mill, with a renewed sense of purpose, throwing himself into his duties with a single-minded focus. He avoided discussing the accident, avoided looking at William's hand, avoided any conversation that might force him to confront his guilt. He became a man of few words, his emotions locked behind a wall of silence. Eleanor and Robert tried to include William in their activities, but they were children themselves, still learning to navigate the complexities of adolescence. They played games in the yard, shared secrets in their bedrooms, and went to school with their friends, leaving William to find his own way. The family's reputation in the neighborhood remained intact. No one questioned the portrait. No one asked about William's hand. No one challenged the carefully constructed narrative of normalcy. The Caldwells were seen as a respectable family, a model of Victorian propriety, their lives a testament to hard work, discipline, and dignity. But beneath the surface, the truth festered. Margaret's anxiety grew, her sleepless nights filled with visions of her son's mangled hand, her husband's cold silence, the whispers she imagined but never heard. Thomas's guilt ate at him, a constant ache in his chest that no amount of work could alleviate. William's loneliness deepened, his sense of isolation growing with every passing day. The portrait, once a source of pride, became a burden, a silent witness to the family's secret, a reminder of the cost of maintaining appearances in a world that valued perfection above all else. The summer of 1900 brought little change to the Caldwell household. The portrait still hung above the fireplace, a silent testament to the family's carefully constructed facade. Margaret continued her efforts to maintain appearances, hosting tea parties, attending church functions, and participating in charitable events. Thomas worked long hours at the mill, his face growing more haggard with each passing week. Eleanor and Robert navigated the challenges of adolescence, their lives filled with school, friends, and the first stirrings of romance. William, now 11, found solace in his art. He spent hours in his room, sketching the world around him with a quiet intensity that surprised his parents. His drawings were filled with detail and emotion, capturing the subtle nuances of light and shadow, the hidden expressions on people's faces, the quiet beauty of everyday life. He began to develop a reputation among his teachers and classmates for his talent, his work praised for its sensitivity and depth. But the portrait remained a source of tension. Margaret watched her son closely, always alert for signs of distress. She saw the way he avoided shaking hands with strangers, the way he tucked his right hand into his pocket when walking in public, the way he flinched when someone looked too long at his hand. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the isolation that came from carrying a secret too heavy for a child to bear. One afternoon, as William was sketching in the parlor, a visitor arrived, a cousin from New Jersey, a woman named Elizabeth who had not seen the family in years. Elizabeth was known for her direct manner and her keen eye for detail. She admired the portrait, complimenting the family's elegance and the boy's stylish glove. William froze, his pencil hovering over the paper. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She saw the panic in her son's eyes, the way his body tensed as if bracing for a blow. Elizabeth leaned closer to the portrait, her gaze fixed on William's gloved hand. "What a curious choice," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Why does the boy wear a single glove indoors?" Margaret's mind raced. She forced a smile, her voice steady despite the sudden surge of panic. "It was just a fashion choice," she said, her words carefully measured. "William has always been fond of gloves." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The conversation moved on, but Margaret could feel the weight of her cousin's unspoken questions, the suspicion that lingered in the air like a shadow. That night, after the visitor had left, Margaret sat with William in his room. She took his gloved hand in hers, her fingers tracing the outline of the leather. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. William looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Do you think she knew?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, her heart aching for her son. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it doesn't matter. We are a family. We love each other. That's all that matters." William nodded, but Margaret could see the doubt in his eyes. The fear that their secret might one day be exposed, that the carefully constructed facade might crumble, leaving them vulnerable to the judgment of the world. The portrait, once a source of pride, became a burden, a silent witness to the family's secret, a reminder of the cost of maintaining appearances in a world that valued perfection above all else. The years passed, and the Caldwell family continued to navigate the complexities of their secret. William grew into a quiet, introspective young man, his art becoming his refuge, his means of expression in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. Margaret's anxiety never fully subsided, her sleepless nights filled with visions of her son's mangled hand, her husband's cold silence, the whispers she imagined but never heard. Thomas's guilt ate at him, a constant ache in his chest that no amount of work could alleviate. Eleanor and Robert grew into adulthood, their lives shaped by the unspoken tensions of their childhood. The portrait remained a fixture in the parlor, a silent witness to the family's carefully constructed facade. It hung above the fireplace, flanked by family heirlooms and framed photographs of ancestors. Every Sunday after church, the family would gather in the parlor to receive visitors, and Margaret would point to the portrait with pride, explaining how it had been taken at Harrington's studio, the finest photographer in Philadelphia. But the truth could not be hidden forever. In 1910, when William was 21, a fire broke out in the Caldwell home. The flames spread quickly, consuming the parlor and the portrait in a matter of minutes. The family escaped unharmed, but the loss of the portrait was a blow to Margaret, a symbol of everything she had worked so hard to preserve. William, now a young man with a quiet dignity, stood in the ashes of the parlor, his gloved hand resting at his side. He looked at the charred remains of the portrait, the image of his younger self consumed by fire. The lie finally laid to rest. Margaret watched her son, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and relief. The secret was gone, the burden lifted, the truth finally exposed. She took William's hand in hers, her fingers tracing the outline of the leather. "It's over," she said. Her voice filled with emotion. "We don't have to hide anymore." William nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. The portrait, once a source of pride, had become a burden, a silent witness to the family's secret, a reminder of the cost of maintaining appearances in a world that valued perfection above all else. But now, in the ashes of the parlor, the truth was finally free, a testament to the resilience of a family that had endured more than anyone could imagine. The Caldwell family rebuilt their home, their lives shaped by the lessons of the past. William continued to draw, his art a reflection of his journey, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Margaret found peace in the knowledge that her family was finally free from the burden of their secret. Thomas's guilt began to ease, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the past. Eleanor and Robert carried the lessons of their childhood into their own families, their lives shaped by the resilience and love that had sustained their parents through the darkest of times. The portrait, once a symbol of their carefully constructed facade, became a memory, a reminder of the cost of maintaining appearances and the strength it takes to face the truth. In the end, the Caldwell family found a measure of peace, their lives a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.